Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and turn the lights off so you can see this. There's a lot of cartoons about grief. It's not something that we talk about a lot, but we are able to diffuse it through humor and different things like this. And here's Death showing up, and he says, "It's your life passing before your eyes, Mrs. Smithers. Now, will you please pay attention? I worked real hard on this PowerPoint presentation." That's how they're having the life flash in front of their eyes. Thank you for coming to this presentation today. It is an honor when anybody listens to you once, and when they come back, that is a double honor. And I am so grateful for you coming, and I'm really grateful to Jerry letting me do this presentation. I do this presentation as part of a larger grief seminar that I do probably 4 or 5 times a year, and I've never been able to get it on tape, and so I'm really excited to get this on tape, and I'm going to be able to hand it out to my masculine grievers that I come in contact through church and hospice and the sheriff's department. Here's a flyer. Okay. And have that available, and also for the churches that are buying the sets. This is going to be a valuable resource. I started this presentation, first did this in 2001. I was, as a fire chaplain, I go every year to our Federation of Fire Chaplains conference, and in 2001 I was planning on skipping the conference. It was in October of that year, and I was going to skip because later on that year I was going to go with our daughter Brittany to London. Her drama group from high school was going to go over, and I thought, well, 2 big trips, can't really afford that this year, especially with her going to Pepperdine the next year. And as I got the flyer for the chaplains conference, I noticed that I was a speaker at the conference. and this is July of 2001. Conference is coming up in October. I called up. I said, wait a second. Nobody's asked me yet. They said, we want you to teach. And I said, what do you want me to do? They said, whatever you want to do. There's a flyer right here. Can you pass that back to him? I had been hearing some research and reading some stuff about masculine grief, and I thought, well, that's going to be a great presentation to do to the chaplains. And so I started putting this together. I called it Grief in the Firehouse. And that was August when I got the presentation put together, and then September 11th happened in 2001. And a month later, I was presenting this material on masculine grief to the Federation of Fire Chaplains. Had the dozen or so chaplains from New York City and that were involved in that. And I had no idea that a month before I did this, we were going to lose 300 firefighters in one event in New York City. And so, but it is very applicable to everybody as we talk about this. I want to introduce you to Kristen. Many of y'all already know her, and this was her 6th grade picture. We had no idea that she left home that day without the lipstick on. Okay. And she was a beautiful girl. Of course, it was 12 years ago that we lost her. It's kind of interesting that Jerry's put me on Friday because it was 12 years ago on Friday of lectureship week that got a call, went home, and we had learned that Kristen's cancer had recurred. She'd been having back pain. Debbie took her in while I was down at conference. We thought it was just scar tissue because they'd gone in through her back 3 times to remove lumps. And it was just all over the place. And so that was really the beginning of the end. And then she finally died on July 24th. And this year is there are transitional points in grief, dates that have great significance. And this year is one of those because we will reach the point, March 24th, she would have been 24 years old this year, died when she was 12. She had osteosarcoma, fought it for 2 years at Cedars-Sinai and UCLA. Did everything we could to save her, and we're not able to do that. But this year marks the year on July 24th when she will have been gone for as long as we had her. And so those are significant dates as we go when we look at this. As we talk about grief, this is my favorite illustration of what grief is like. It's like a puzzle with a piece missing. And I don't know if you've ever gone and put together a jigsaw puzzle and you get to the end and there's a piece missing. And it's just so frustrating. You're just so upset. Go ahead and take a handout. It is just so frustrating to go and to do that. And you get to the end of the piece is missing, and all you can focus on right then is that stupid piece is missing. You know, like, why did I waste my time putting this puzzle together when all the pieces aren't here? And at first, all you can do is just focus on that missing piece. But then as you move through it, you're able to move away, and you begin to realize that, you know, the rest of the picture is beautiful. And it's still beautiful, even without that missing piece. And you know what the piece looks like. You can figure that out. Or if it's a puzzle you put together before, you know what that missing piece is like. And that's really what grief is about. That piece is always going to be missing. But life can become beautiful again as you get a different perspective, as you move your focus from the missing piece to what you still have and what you have in your heart. But nothing can take the place of that part. Okay? And that's important for us to remember. You have on your handouts, the first page, there's a list of definitions there. This is one of the best definitions of grief. I've seen definitions that are a couple of paragraphs long. And in my usual seminar, we spend about, I can spend 6 hours talking about this definition. That grief is the normal, appropriate, emotional response to loss. It is unique to the individual experiencing that, and we're going to talk about that today. And there is no general timetable for completing it. So one of the things we need to understand is that when we talk about grief work, we never use the word closure. You hear that word time and time again. All the television reporters and everybody talk about, oh, this is going to bring the family closure, that's going to bring the family closure. No, there is no such thing as closure when you're dealing with grief work. It is going to be a part of who you are forever as you go through this. And to just show how normal it is, we have, I found this picture in the quote of Scripture where Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, in one of the translations, Jesus says, I am deeply grieved. Even to the point, even to death, remain here and stay awake with me. Jesus was grieving his own death, grieving the loss of relationships that he was going to lose as he went to the cross. And one of the things that I find is that in the church situations, many times we'll have people wanting to not admit that grief is going to be a part of their healing. And saying, no, we're not going to grieve. We're going to celebrate their life. Well, if Jesus, the founder of our faith, grieved, who are we to think that we're going to be able to go through losses and not grieve as well? And what I want us to understand is that grief is not something that is wrong with us. So often, and especially in the medical community, we come at things as problems. That grief is a problem, and we need to find some way to fix this problem or to heal this problem. And it isn't. It isn't. It is a natural way that God has wired us to deal with the transitions in our life. It is a lot of cognitive process that goes on as we readjust to a new world, as we try to give new meaning to grief. Niemeyer is a great one for talking about reconstruction of meaning as he deals with grief work. And so we need to realize that grief is normal. It's nothing wrong with you as you go through grief. And you're not the only one who has felt the things that you're feeling or to think you're going crazy. It's perfectly normal. And it is an appropriate emotional response to loss. We're going to be talking about that more. And it's unique to the individual experiencing it. As we go through this, let me just quickly give you a multidimensional aspects of grief and how it's going to fit us in the different parts. We are all made up of a physical aspect. We have a mental aspect to us. We have an emotional aspect to us. And you have a page there with all the circles, and I'm going to give you some stuff to write on that. And we have a spiritual aspect. This is a model of who we are as human beings. This is how God has created us. It's a very biblical model because Christ told us that we're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. All of these 4 dimensions. And they're all involved in grief. If you could see these dimensions as being energy reservoirs that are interlinked, and like maybe a series of batteries that are linked in series, and with that series of batteries and these energy reservoirs, you put energy into your system through every one of these 4 areas. And in the same way, you can also take a load or drain the system through any one of these areas. Go ahead and get a sheet right there. We energize the system physically through basically 4 ways. We eat, we hydrate ourselves, we drink our water, or we're supposed to drink our water, and that gives us the ability to go and metabolize the food that we're taking in. We sleep, and we exercise. And those 4 areas put energy into the system. Mentally, we energize the system through doing what you're doing right now, learning something new. If you want to stay young, if you want to stay active and energized, stay involved in a community college or seminars or something, just go and learn something new. You can also break habits. Anytime you break habits and do something differently, you're going to build new connections between the neurons in your brain, and it's going to energize the system. It's so hard to break habits, but it's good for us to do that. Emotionally, we energize the system through acts of service, giving and receiving of love. And as we serve and as we love and as we give love and receive love, that puts energy into our banks. And spiritually, we energize the system through worship. We are wired. I guess there was a class yesterday, wired for worship, wired for spiritual connection. And it's really true. Everybody in the world worships. And basically, everybody does the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, Hindu, Catholic, whatever it is. We're all basically doing the same kinds of things as we worship. We're wired that way. God made us that way. Newsweek had a big debate a couple of years ago, did a big report on whether or not we're wired that way because there's a God, or whether they think there's a God because that's the way we're wired. And, of course, we're going to go and say, well, God wired us that way. So, now then, if you take energy out of one of these systems, if you kind of see these as maybe a balloon, and I puncture a balloon, it's going to draw air out of all the other systems. And it's going to affect every other system. For instance, if you get physically sick, let's say you get the flu, well, you're going to stay home from work. But while you're staying home from work, you had better not go and try to balance your checkbook that day. You're just not going to have the mental energy to do those computations. It's just not going to be there. And so you see all this energy is flowing out physically, but it's going to affect mentally. Emotionally, when I get sick, I'm a big baby. I'm a crab, okay? And you know men, okay? You just don't have the emotional energy to be nice. And you want to be left alone, or you want people to do what you want them to do in the way you want them to do it. You just don't have the energy to go and to interact and to be nice anymore. Now then, let's talk about how grief affects this system. Grief, we said, is an emotional response to loss. And so it's like when you have a physical heart attack, it affects all these other systems. Grief is an emotional heart attack that's going to suck energy out of all these other areas. For instance, the way you energize the system through eating and drinking, sleeping, and exercise, those are going to be affected. And there's going to be a host of other physical effects of grief. Symptoms, physical pain, feel like a heart attack, shortness of breath, palpitations, all this stuff is going on. But you may have a change in appetite. You may not feel like eating. You may feel like you need to eat all the time. You may have trouble sleeping. And or you may sleep all the time. And of those 4, the most important is sleep. Because you've got to do that to process the information that's going on. Mentally, grief affects you. Short-term memory is affected. Mainly because your brain is doing a new job. Grief is a mental reconstruction. And as your brain is having to process this new rush job that's put on it, all the other jobs are going to get put on the sideline, and you're not going to do them very well. And so, the secretary in your brain is not going to remember all those appointments, not going to remember dates. We have a hard time making decisions. Okay? And bless our hearts, we go to somebody who's in grief, and we say, oh, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. Well, they don't know what to do with themselves. And we've given them an added job of finding a task for you. and so I tell you, don't go and say that. If you know them, just go and do something. Don't even ask permission, just go and do it. and take that burden of making a decision off of their backs. That's just a couple of ways that mental gets involved in this. Emotionally, you have all this emotional energy flowing out, and it's hard to let any emotion in. It's like a salmon swimming upstream. It is very, very tough. And plus, you go through a thing called detachment. And detachment is where this hurt so bad, I don't want to ever hurt this bad again. Therefore, I'm going to let go of you now while I'm hurting. Dying people detach. They let go in order to grab onto the other side. We're trying to stay attached to them while they're detaching and hold on to them. But then when they go, we detach. And we have a hard time. The divorce rate for couples that have had a child with leukemia. Leukemia is a 3-year protocol. Kristen went through 2 years, and we had just about reached the end of our rope. It nearly destroyed us. And I don't know if we could have handled another year of surgeries and chemotherapies and everything else. It just drains you. There is they are 75% more likely to get divorced than the general population. General population is 50%, and then you go and add that on. A lot of it has to do with grief and the difference between masculine and feminine styles of grieving, but it is just so emotionally draining. You detach and you withdraw, and that's very difficult, especially for the wives, to handle that kind of detachment, because we're supposed to be there for each other. Okay? And we had people that told us, at least you have each other. No. Debbie found a book, and in the book it had a quote that says, 2 wounded oxen don't pull a cart very well. Okay? And so when a couple has lost a child, they need to find an outside support. A couple of different reasons. You're not going to go through the same stages of grief at the same time, and you're going to do it differently. And so you need to find some support from outside, and you don't have energy for each other. You're in survival mode, and you don't even have enough energy for yourself, much less to go and to give to your spouse. Spiritually, anger is also going to be a part of that, and some people have anger, some people don't. It's okay. It's what you do with your anger. Spiritually, it's about meaning reconstruction. About going, your world has been shaken by this, and you have to find a way to give meaning to this experience to go on. Now, the important thing about this is that we want to keep all of this flowing. You want to get this energy out. You don't want to stop it up. And because if you stop it up, you end up in trouble. Okay? Those of you that know us, I can't get away on Easter. To go, and Debbie's family is all from up north, and mine's down in San Diego, and so we have a big Easter celebration at our house. And we have like 60 people over to our house, and we hide about 2,000 eggs on Saturday. And a couple of years ago, we were having this gathering, and the plumbing stopped up in the middle of the front yard with 60 people. That's not good. The stuff started coming out places it wasn't supposed to come out. And, and if you think that's a mess, stop up your grief. I tried it. I tried to stuff it for 6 months, and it exploded. It really, really did. And so we need to keep that. It's like I tell my kids, if you're going to sneeze, cover your mouth, but don't hold your nose, you're going to blow your brains out. That energy has got to get out, and it's got to go someplace. And so there's, how do we do that? Well, let's go back to this. Grief is it's an appropriate emotional. You need to get that emotion out. For many, many years, the normal way, or the way that has been seen as normal to express grief emotionally, has been to cry and to talk. We want to get you to cry about it. We want you to get to talk about it. And when I have somebody that is grieving in that style, if they start crying, I'm not going to hand them a Kleenex. If in my support group, I tell them, if you need a Kleenex, reach for it, because we're not going to hand you a Kleenex, because so often that action is seen as, here, dry up. And I don't want you to dry up. I want to give you permission to grieve and to express that. And I'll tell you, I'll be talking and somebody will start crying, they'll apologize. And then I'll say, no, I was guiding the conversation to get you to cry. You're doing what you need to be doing. But the unfortunate part of that is that there is a huge segment of the population that does not grieve in a feminine style. And we're using the terms feminine and masculine, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through this. But there is a uniqueness about grief. There is no right way to do it. You're going to grieve. You will grieve. You can stuff it for as long as you try. There may be some things that complicate it, but grief is a normal process. There is a clinic in Seattle that was so popular and had such popular grief groups, they had to turn people away. One of the therapists did an outcome study, looked at everybody that had been through their program, and then looked at a bunch of people that had tried to get in and couldn't get in, looked at an outcome down here, a year or 2 years down, same outcome. So I'm in a good field. You're going to get better no matter what I do. And, well, actually, grief is the only human experience that can be made more difficult by intervention. And that's really our problem. People intervene and they make it more difficult for us, or we make it more difficult. So let's talk about how it's unique to the individual. First of all, the relationship. Your grief is going to be impacted by the relationship that you had with somebody. One of them, this is the fill-in-the-blank section on the sheets. Oh, let me get this on the tape. If you would like, if you're listening to this tape and would like the handout, you can email me at steven.g.k@gte.net. That is steven.g.kay@gte.net. And all this material is on our church website, redlandscoc.org. So if you want this, the PowerPoint, you can email me and I'll send it to you. One person dies in a family, but everybody had a different relationship with that person who died. And so everybody's grief is going to be different because everybody has lost somebody different. It may be it was a more distant relationship to somebody, and it may be that it was like their life link. And so the relationship is going to impact your grief. It's like the great theologian Garth Brooks wrote a couple years ago. I could have missed the pain, but I would have missed the dance. And so because of the dance that you have, that's going to determine the amount of pain that you're going to suffer. The second thing we look at is, what is your history of loss? The economy of grief is the opposite of the economy of the world. Usually in the world's economy, those who have more get more, do better. In grief, those who have less actually do better. People that have not had much control over their lives are going to do better because they're used to not having control. And one of the gifts of death is that it removes the illusion of control. We are not in control here in this world. And death comes along and tells us. And so those that have had a great history of loss are going to do better, because I had a man, I was doing his father's funeral. Here was this fellow that I was talking to. He was 58 years old, and he had never known anybody who had died before. And now all of a sudden he's having to bury his dad, who was his best friend. And he says, I've been really fortunate. And I said, no, you needed some other losses to get you ready for this one. How terrible to be hit by that. What are your coping skills? Grief is about feeling pain and experiencing pain. How well do you cope with pain? If you have a history of drug abuse or alcoholism, it's going to be tough, because those things are about running from pain. And in grief, you have to experience the pain. There is no way other than to get through it than to experience the pain. Your religious or spiritual perspective. Just because you have a religious perspective on life, that does not mean you're going to handle grief easier. The first 2 funerals that I did as a hospice chaplain were for 2 ladies that came from a charismatic background. And they did not want their church to know that they were dying, because they had that perspective. And this is not an indictment of all charismatic people, okay? Understand that. But the church they had gone to, they had gotten the message that if you had enough faith, you wouldn't be dying. Well, guess what? Everybody dies, and but still, they saw that as it would have been reflected negatively, and they didn't want their church to know and their preacher to know that they were dying. Ended up doing their funerals. Gender differences, and here we come. This is where we get into the meat of today. As we talk about this, I want you to understand that everything we're going to talk about is falls on a continuum. Okay. And I don't think there is anyone who doesn't cry at some point. That there are a few, okay? But I'm going to be talking way over here about masculine, okay? But I want you to understand that everybody's going to fall someplace on this line. And as I talk about masculine grief, that's not a really good term to use because we have some women who grieve in a masculine style, and we have some men who grieve in a feminine style. And it's nothing to say that there's something wrong about them. That's just the way that they're wired. And we have a whole lot of people that are going to have a blended style in here, okay? And I think that one of the books that we're using as a resource is this Swallowed by a Snake by Thomas Golden called The Gift of Masculine Grief. And he thinks that people that are going to grieve in a feminine style can gain some insight from masculine styles of grieving and use some ritual in a way to go and to handle their grief. So, Ken Doka and Terry Martin, they have done some research in a book called Men Don't Cry, Women Do. And the subtitle for this, see, they go and get you with the title like I did with this course. The subtitle is Transcending Gender Stereotypes of Grief. And they're really big on saying that it's not masculine and feminine. And one of the things they've used is I kind of look at this as a stoic style and an emotive style. But Doka and Martin have come up with the terminology of the masculine style they're going to call instrumental grievers, and the feminine style intuitive. So there's a lot of good research. Swallowed by a Snake is a real good popular reading book, and you can go to Golden's website. Just Google Thomas Golden, and you'll get his website. And I've had some people that have ordered off of there and gotten a signed copy. He is just a great insight into this. Martin and Doka's book is a much more scholarly approach to it. And they quote a lot of research, and they actually have a assessment tool in the back so that you can see which style you are. So, men and women grieve differently, and let me just go and use these general terms of masculine and feminine. I want to talk about some factors that contribute to these differences. First of all, we have a natural disposition. Some people are just better at doing some things than other people. You know, my dad can build anything. I can break anything. I just have no skill when it comes to construction, working on cars. That just is not me. I'm able to build with words. You know, that's my gift. So just a natural disposition. Some people are just going to do grief better because they just are able to do that. We have some physiological differences. This is where it gets interesting. We'll talk about crying. Access to emotional tears is controlled by a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin is produced by the pituitary gland. With the name prolactin, you can see some of what it has to do with as we get the word lactate from that, okay? When we're children, little boys and little girls generally have the same levels of prolactin or access to the same levels of prolactin as one another. That's why little boys can cry just about as well as little girls can. Again, remember, we have that continuum. Everybody's going to be individual. When we hit puberty, guys, thank goodness, prolactin level is decreased in boys. As we go through and become men and mature, that prolactin level is decreased. That's good. We don't want to be going and lactating. It's going to go up in the women. Interestingly enough, when we go through the changes at the end of life, you know, women, they have menopause. Men have the same kind of change that they go through. It's not as profound. But those prolactin levels can increase in men again. And that's why you can have an 80-year-old guy who's never cried, and all of a sudden he's crying at the drop of a hat. What's gone on? Prolactin kicked in. Okay? So if you're not able to cry, there's nothing wrong with you. You just don't have enough prolactin. One of the other things you need to understand about crying is that there is a chemical difference between tears that are produced by an emotional stimulus and tears that are produced by a physical stimulus, such as an irritant, a piece of sand in your eye. Chemically different tears. And grief is basically a stress reaction. And you need to get those stressor chemicals out of the system. And there's two ways you can do that. You can sweat them out, go and exercise and use them up, which is really good. That gets your body and brain in sync. Your brain is tired because it's doing this work 24/7, and you're just sitting around not doing anything with your body, and it's got all this adrenaline, and it wants to go. That's why you have some sleep problems. So if you can exercise, you get that out, or you can cry that stuff out. And that's why if you feel like crying, give into it. There's a reason we have the phrase in English, have a good cry. It does you good. And I had a lady call me up one time, says, I'm so afraid to give in to crying, I don't think I'll be able to stop. And I said, I've been in this for a while, and I've never seen anyone admitted to the ER because they couldn't quit crying. You will cry until you get it out. And, so she thanked me for that. And I guess went on and cried. Get it out. Get it out if that's your physiological thing. There is another difference in physiology, and there is a construction in the brain called the corpus callosum. Your brain has two hemispheres. I think everybody knows about this. There's two halves to your brain. And the corpus callosum is the structure that connects the two sides of the brain, allows communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. Well, guess what? In women, it is thicker than in men. And what they theorize is that your speech center is in one hemisphere of the brain. Your emotional center is in the other hemisphere of the brain. Okay? And what they theorize is that because the corpus callosum is thicker, women are better able to put their emotions into words. Now, guys, that doesn't give us an excuse for not talking. But ladies, understand, we just often can't get the words to what we're feeling. We don't have the connective tissue that you have. Here, I found this cartoon. Here they are. The lady says, now that we've invented language, let's talk about our relationship. And he's realizing, I made a mistake by fixing that problem, He was wanting to go and to be able to give instructions. Now, we're going to talk about relationship. And here you may like this one. Here's the man standing at the casket of his wife. He says to the minister, just give me a few last minutes with her while her mouth is still closed. If you get me a cartoon that does the other side, I'll put it in, okay? I will honestly do that. Okay. So we've talked about physiological and the natural disposition. The third difference we have are psychological differences. Men have a tremendous need for autonomy. We have a tremendous need for autonomy. To be independent. Okay? Whereas women have a tremendous need for connection. A couple of years ago, we moved from up in the Central Valley down to Santa Paula, which is just a half hour from Magic Mountain, which gave everybody a reason to come see us. And Debbie has 3 sisters and a sister-in-law and 1 brother, and we pray for him. But all of her sisters came down with their kids to go to Magic Mountain with us. And I had a miserable time that day because I went to Magic Mountain for a different reason than my wife and her sisters went. I went because I was going to conquer every ride. That's what Magic Mountain is about. We pay good money. I'm going to get my money's worth out of this thing. And I hit the park, and I have the entire park planned and mapped, and I know which ride we ought to ride when so that we can get on them all. Okay. My wife and her sisters went just to talk, just to be together. You know, I got them in the gate, and I got them in the first line, and then we ride the ride, and then we get off the ride, and I'm ready to start off to ride number 2, and they just stop and start talking. And they're not talking about what ride to ride, they're just talking. And I'm over there, you know, we gotta go, and they're just, and finally, you know, after about 20 minutes, they get around, well, what ride should we go on next? I know, I've got the whole day planned. And it was a miserable time for me. I have learned just to let them be. And simply to go and to be there and to buy the food and to protect them and do whatever else.
Something that's on the continuum too?
Yes.
Because I see men that have a tremendous need to connect and women who
Yes.
are very autonomous.
Yes.
So
Yeah. It just depends upon their psychological disposition, how they are created. And we have some women that do this in a masculine way. Let me see, what else do I want to do about psychologically? If you think about it, men operate in a hierarchy. If you look at the traditionally masculine fields of law enforcement, sports, the armed forces, there is a hierarchy, and men operate within a hierarchy. We know where our ranking is in that hierarchy. Women talk in order to connect and to commune. Men talk and see communication as a way of establishing hierarchy. That's why it's really easy for men to misinterpret a suggestion by their wife or even a request by their wife as an order. That's the way we perceive these things. I have a really difficult time working in the healthcare industry, because the healthcare industry. You want to come in? We've got plenty of seats. Oh, okay. The healthcare industry is dominated by women, and it is a different world than fire chaplaincy and police chaplaincy. In the fire service and police service, we have a thing called ICS, Incident Command System. Every fire department, every police department has an ICS plan, and it's the same wherever you go. And so I can go on scene in another town, and I know exactly how that police and how that disaster is working because of ICS. Well, in hospice, we have an organization called JACO, the Joint Commission for Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, the Gestapo organization that come in. And what happens in these healthcare organizations is that they want us to put our hospice together. They have some things they're looking for, but they don't tell us how to run it. That's up to us to decide how we're going to run. And so we get together and we form an interdisciplinary team, and we discuss and we write and we come up with this way, and hopefully JACO's going to like it. And it's terribly frustrating for me because I'm saying, why doesn't JACO just tell us the organization they want and we'll do it? Amen. But that's not the way it works, because it's a feminine organization. And it's very, very difficult. So we have these psychological things.
Don't follow difficult.
Yeah. The other thing about autonomy, men see grief as their burden, and they don't want to go and to put their burden on you. It's my task, I'm going to do it, and it's not right for me to put my grief on your grief. And yet the wife or the woman is thinking, if you really value our relationship, you're going to share your burden with me. It doesn't work that way. That's not for men. And for men to be able to go and to show that they're vulnerable, they're going to have to know that they are esteemed. Otherwise, they're not going to let down their guard. A lot of different things we could talk about as we go through this. There are some cultural differences. What does a culture allow a person to do? What are we expecting of a person within a culture? And we're not going to get people to violate their cultural norms to do grief. And unfortunately, our culture really doesn't have a lot of grief ritual, or we don't talk about it. And Golden was a licensed counselor. Got out, started his practice, I think, late 60s, early 70s, came into a group, And they gave him, because he was a man, they gave him all the men clients, which weren't very many. But one of the things he discovered is that everything that he had learned about counseling technique did not work with men. Because most men don't go for counseling. It's women that go, and the counseling models are based. And, with women, you want to go and you want to face them directly. You want to be making eye contact that way. My wife, she doesn't think I'm listening unless my eyes are locked on her eyes. And for men, that doesn't work. If I go and get in you and we're going to make eye contact, I'm invading your space. And I'm challenging you. And so if you're going to set up a counseling office to counsel men, you need to kind of offset the chairs, have an angle so you're not direct at each other. There's a hospice in the Chesapeake Bay that they have a charter fishing boat that they go out, and they take all the masculine grievers, all the men grievers out on this fishing boat. And the guys are standing at the rail, so they're not looking at each other's faces, and they do a lot of talking while they're fishing because there's not a confrontation. And, if there does a tear come, that's just a piece of salt spray, And so we're not opening up the window of our heart. Cultural expectations, and then role expectations. Let's say mom has died, and dad has been the rock of the family. And everybody's looking at dad, and they're saying, well, why isn't he losing it? What's wrong with him? Didn't he love her? Why isn't he giving in? But if we get the rock to crack, that's going to make those children, surviving children's world, that much less safe. Dad is going to fulfill his role. And that's why a lot of men, they're going to continue to work. They're going to continue to do what they need to do to keep the family together because that's their role expectation. And by doing their role expectation, they are grieving. Right after 9/11, it was the next day, I saw an interview on Today's Show with one of the young firefighters. He was a rookie, lost the other shift on that call, and the reporter asked him, he said, you've just seen how incredibly dangerous your profession is. Do you have any second thoughts about being a firefighter? And the kid said, no, I am a firefighter and I will always be a firefighter. And by doing his job, he's going to be working out his grief. One of the things we do as chaplains on fire scene is, if we have an injury or a critical incident, we have to be very careful because somebody might think, well, you have some guy who's injured, we need to pull his whole team off. Well, not always, because if we do that, they're not able to do what they're supposed to do. And that may injure them even more emotionally than letting them continue to work. If they can function, we're going to let them keep doing it. Well, I want to share this picture with you because this is really a picture of masculine grief at work. This is Kristen's funeral as we're coming to the gravesite in Santa Paula. And you can see here's me and Walt, my mother and father-in-law, Walt and Joanne Loftus are here. And all the uncles, my brothers and brother-in-law, were all carrying the casket. And I want you to see the guys are my fire department of Santa Paula, and nobody organized this. They didn't come to the cemetery with a plan that we're going to do this. They had done some great things for Kristen. They did a final tone over the communication system for Kristen. They flew the flag at half-mast on this day for her at the fire station. But as they're there, they just, they loved her so much, and they were grieving. The whole town was grieving her loss. That they just formed this honor guard. It was something for them to do. And I love the line that Golden has in his book. He says, it's not because the casket's heavy that the men carry it. What else do we let them do to show their grief? Okay? And so that's why you see these police. There's going to be a huge police funeral today in L.A. We had an airport police officer that was killed. 5,000 officers are going to come from around the state to be a part of that. And this ritual that we do allows us to express our grief. And that was just a very meaningful moment to me to see my guys that had just supported me. I was one of their 2 first fire chaplains in Santa Paula, and that's like your first love. You don't get over that, and there's a special relationship. And I'm planning that on the day that after I die, that I'm wanting a crew from the fire station to carry my casket and place it right next to Kristen's. So it was neat to see them doing this. And these are all big, tough guys. Yes, Ron?
Is that the reason my brother's having a really hard time talking to his 2 brothers, the 2 people that are probably the men that are the closest to them?
Yeah, men, we don't talk. We don't talk a lot. It's and plus, there may not be the emotional energy to have conversations. You know, when somebody's close to you, that's going to be a deep and meaningful conversation. And you may not have the energy. I have some patients that they will talk to the nurses and staff that come in, but they can't talk to their family members because they may be their last words to them, and they don't have the emotional energy to interact with them. So, but this is masculine grief. I want to tell you a story. Grief is like Golden's book, Swallowed by a Snake. He tells a story about there was a time when boa constrictors were huge snakes, and their favorite food was humans. And they would just go into any village at any time and just eat a human. And this caused a lot of grief. Well, there was a flute player in one village who was listening to a woman whose child had been swallowed by a snake. And he decided he needed to do something about this. And so he went out into the jungle, sat down quietly, began playing his flute. He heard a snake approach him, and he held very still so the snake would swallow him whole, which it did. And he finds himself in the belly of this snake, and he makes himself as comfortable as he can. He takes out his pocket knife, and he had some water there, and he cuts a chunk out of the belly of the snake. And the snake didn't like that, and so it made some room inside there for the man, and he got a little bit more comfortable. But the snake began telling all the other snakes, don't eat these humans. They've gone bad on us. I've got one inside me, and it's killing me. And so the man, as he continued, as hunger would get him, he would continue to cut away at the belly of the snake. Finally, he got to the heart, killed the snake, and got out and came back to tell the village. Now, the applications that Golden makes from the story are that we feel cut off from our everyday life. One of the questions that every masculine griever is going to hear at some point is, why aren't you grieving? And many times, especially in the case of a loss of a child that is going to come from the wife who is angry and frustrated, why aren't you grieving? Why is this tearing me so up and you aren't grieving? And the man is asking that same question, why aren't I grieving? Well, they are. We can't get away from our grief. It is every place we go. We feel confined, surrounded by our grief. Our world is completely changed. It may look like we're going on as life is normal, but it isn't. We may feel that there is no way out. Everywhere I turn, there's darkness. I'm in a cave. Grief, we need to understand, is not a short-term project. You know, isn't it great? Our friends give us about 3 weeks and they say, oh, are things back to normal? No, you know, that missing puzzle piece, things will never be normal again. And it's not a short-term project. I think it was about 3 years before Debbie looked at me one day and said, you know, I'm really feeling kind of good. Masculine grief uses activities to deal with grief, and we're going to talk about these. What happens is grief moves us out of routines and habits, and it thrusts us into a time and place that seems chaotic and unpredictable. And we need a way to access a small portion of our pain and chaos. The tendency is, pardon? Go back?
No, close the door.
Close the door? Okay. And so we need a way to access a small portion of our pain. It's kind of like the relief valve on a pressure cooker. If you just stop that up, it's going to blow up. But if it goes and set it at a certain pressure, it will release small things. And that's what masculine grief uses activities to do. Grief, he talks about ritual, gives us a way to release the chaos within our system a bit at a time. Well, what are grief rituals? They are any activity that is intended to connect you to your pain and grief, and that allows you to move out of the ordinary awareness and into the experience of grief in a safe way for a period of time. And that's how Golden defines it. Well, let me talk about ritual and structure. Let me do this really fast. Ritual has containment, beginning and ending point. He compares it to a car on a roller coaster. You get in the car. There is a ritual elder. He went and did cultural anthropology studies to learn how to deal with masculine grief in this country. So he went and studied third world countries and ancient cultures to see how those men dealt with grief. We don't have ritual elders. We have maybe ministers and counselors, therapists kind of fall into that role, doctors. There is a thing called submission where you submit to this activity. In this activity, you are deconstructed, and then you are reconstructed. Deconstruction, reconstruction. And if you look at this, you know what this is? This is boot camp. This is a boot camp. You know? You go and you've got 9 weeks. Drill sergeant, take you apart. You submit to it. They tear you apart, and then they rebuild you. Well, let me talk about some types of ritual as we just have a couple of minutes here. There are thought rituals. There was one man, his wife died. He's left two small children, and all of a sudden he's Mr. Mom. And, I have had to take care of my kids when Debbie goes out of town. I don't know how you ladies do it. Thank you for all that you do. Well, here's a guy who's having to do all of this, plus grieve. He could not let down during the day because he had to get up, get the kids ready, get the breakfast, get lunches made, get them to school, go to work, come home and do, dinner, dishes, and homework and all that stuff. But what this guy would do a couple of times a week is he would sit down after the kids were in bed, would take out the old photo album, and would sit there and would go through the album, thinking and recognizing what he had lost. That was a ritual. That was how he was dealing with his grief. If he had sat down with a six-pack and just anesthetized himself, that would have been running from the grief, and some people do that. I'll tell you, Viagra is really impacting masculine grief because all of a sudden these old guys can go out and get a new woman, and they can use sex and other stuff to go and to run from their pain, and they don't have to hurt. They think. Okay? So thought rituals. There are practical rituals. One fellow was wondering why he wasn't grieving. His wife he was dismayed at how the death of their child had just torn his wife apart, and she was weeping inconsolably. And he was wondering why he wasn't grieving as he was out in his workshop carving the headstone for his child's grave. He's doing something practical to go through. These seminars that I do, I'm processing my grief as I go and I do this. Golden and his brother went to their father's workshop, and using old scraps of wood from old projects and their dad's tools, they built the container for their dad's ashes. They were grieving as they did that, okay? And so there's some practical things. There was one runner was running a marathon with his father, and of course he was younger and was farther ahead. His father died halfway through the marathon of a heart attack on a bridge. He got his dad's effects, and one of the things that his dad had was a runner's watch with elapsed time on it. And he got that, and it was still running. The fellow didn't turn off that elapsed time indicator, but as he trained for the next year's marathon, he put that watch on. And his dad ran with him for the next year. The next year, as he got to the bridge, he stopped in the middle, took his dad's watch off, stopped it, and threw it into the river. Here was a way of going. And running and exercise is good for men because if the sweat covers up the tears that you may be shedding, okay? So there's some practical ones. One of the things is that there's not always sadness when a person dies. There was one lady who was in an abusive relationship with her husband. She had him cremated, which I may speak to some of that relationship. But then she was stuck with, what do I do with the guy's ashes? Well, she would take a spoonful of his ashes every day or so and sprinkle them in the driveway because as she thought it made her feel good to run the SOB over a couple of times every day. That was worth more than any therapy session. Talk about dealing with anger. Oh man, there's a way to do it. Got rid of the ashes, got rid of her anger. She was able to heal. There are rituals of creativity. This is where a lot of the grief books come from. People have kept journals, songwriting, painting, sculpture, all of these things. Eric Clapton's son died. He wrote the song Tears in Heaven. Okay? So these rituals of creativity can go and let you process the pain. And so what I want you to understand as we talk about masculine grief is that we may not talk, we may not cry, but there are things that we're going to do that will deal with our grief. And I think feminine grievers can benefit from some of these as well as men can benefit from talking. But, men aren't going to talk with a big group. They're going to usually do it one-on-one with somebody very trusted. Let me share this cartoon with you. For better or for worse, the mom has died. I read the comics first. It's the only true thing in the paper. Okay? Mom has died. The son has come home. He says, "What do you want to do with Mom's clothes, Dad?" Dad says, "Well, give them away, I guess." And he says, "Everything but this." And the son goes, "Well, that's just an old smock." And Dad goes, "Not quite. She always wore this when she was gardening. When I think of her, I think of laughter and flowers. I want to keep this." And he sighs. He says, "You're never too old for a blankie." And I want you to see this man as he'll probably sit down and maybe take this to bed with him and hold it, or maybe sit in the rocking chair and smell it. Maybe still has some of her perfume on it or the smell of the garden. And he's going to be connecting with his wife. We don't have time to talk about Warden's model, but I want you to note that this is I detached when Kristen died. I pulled back from my relationships. Kristen told Debbie the night that we told her that she was going to die that we needed to have a new baby. And of course, Debbie immediately wanted to fulfill that wish after Kristen died 2 days later. I was not interested in any more family. In fact, the family I had was too much for me to handle. But eventually, as I began to heal, I began to see her need for that, and I began to feel a need, and I reattached. And so I want to share a picture with you of here's Debbie. This is Brittany, who just finished her junior year at Pepperdine. She is a psychology major, wants to do art therapy with kids. There was an art therapist at Cedars that worked with her. But I want you to see Jennifer and Samantha. We adopted them, okay? And they were 3 and 5 when we got them, sisters. And I tell you, I love them no different than I love Brittany. And so I want you to see the healing that has come about in my life, that life does get good again. That yes, you can learn to love again, and you have to learn to love again and to attach. And so we went from a family of 4 to a family of 3, and now we're a family of 6. Kristen will always be one of our daughters. People ask me, how many kids do you have? And if I don't have time, I say 4. And if they want to know, inquire anymore, I said, well, we have 1 who's in heaven and 3 that are still here with us. And these girls are in our family because of Kristen's legacy. And it is Kristen continuing to live on in them. I thank you for coming and sharing in this with me. It's been an honor.